Welcome. My name is Eli Gold. I'm the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy here in Washington, D.C. Today, I've asked Joseph Humire to join us and provide an assessment as to Russia's influence in Latin America. We have currently a war, Russia's war on Ukraine, which is occupying all of our attention. But yet there's so many other things that are happening. We have China and Taiwan, an emboldened Iran, an aggressive North Korea, confused European Union, a concerned NATO, an energy crisis, a refugee crisis, now refugees from a whole host of countries. And the definition of refugees is debatable. But what's happening is, and I've said this for a while, everybody's focused on Ukraine. We are often missing what is happening across the globe, and most notably, and what we're going to be discussing today, is Russia's increasing influence in the Americas, in South America. Let me introduce our guest here. Joseph Humire is a national security expert specialized in analyzing transregional threat networks in the Western Hemisphere. Joseph provides regular briefings and lectures to various entities within the U.S. Defense Department on combating international terrorism, countering transnational organized crime, as well as China, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah's influence in the Americas. He has testified numerous times before the U.S. Congress, as well as the European and Canadian parliaments. Joseph has also served as expert witness to several important terrorism trials in South America, including an ongoing trial of an accused Hezbollah operative in Peru. I had the pleasure of having Joseph participate in meetings that I hosted in Washington in our office, talking about issues relating to the border crisis and so on. But right now, I think we have something that is so very important that we really need to start paying attention to. So for that, Joseph, the floor is yours, and I really appreciate you joining us and giving us your analysis of what's happening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eli, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with the Gold Institute, both with your staff and fellows and everybody else that's connected online. And let me just begin by saying that for those that don't know me, my name is Joseph Humire. I'm the executive director of a national security think tank based in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Secure Free Society. However, I'm currently in Bogota, Colombia, because one of the things that we do at the center, and one of the things that I've done over the last 10, 15 years in my professional career, has been to do a lot of field research. And obviously the pandemic hampered that a little bit, but now that we're kind of pushing past the pandemic, I'm going back again to Latin America to get a sense of what's going on from on the ground. I think it's very important to visit these countries to understand what's happening in a local context, but to have a geopolitical and a global awareness and analysis. So with that, let me say that I think this conversation about Russia and Latin America really has gone up a notch, particularly since the invasion of Vladimir Putin into Ukraine. But more specifically, about a month prior, I think it was on January 13th, if I believe, that the deputy foreign minister of Russia, during an interview, in what seemed almost like a planted question, there was a reporter that asked, would you discard deploying military assets to Venezuela or Cuba if NATO or any other international organization is to deter any type of actions on Ukraine? And the deputy foreign minister of Russia responded very kind of in kind with, "Oh no, we would never discard that. That's a permanent option that's on the table for Russia." So the thing with that statement, which I think was very kind of a orchestrated statement by the foreign ministry of Russia, was that they led people to believe that the deployment of military assets from Russia to Latin America in general, and Cuba and Venezuela in particular, is a new thing, and it's not. In fact, the Russian foreign ministry is a little too late in making that claim because they've already deployed a tremendous amount of military assets, both to Venezuela and Cuba, as well as other countries in the region, namely Nicaragua. In fact, Venezuela is the largest purchaser of Russian armament in the Western Hemisphere, purchasing close to 12 million. I think the latest number is 11.6, I'm sorry, not million, billion, $11.6 billion worth of armament in the last 20 years. And that's essentially the number one arms customer of Russia in the Western Hemisphere. But they've also deployed military assets to Cuba. There was a spy ship that docked in Cuba in 2019. We all are familiar with General Gerasimov and his doctrine of hybrid warfare. Gerasimov inaugurated a counter-narcotic center in Managua, Nicaragua. So there's been an increase in Russian military activity in Latin America for at least the last decade, if not more. In fact, when John Kelly, before he was in the White House, when he was a commander of Southern Command in U.S. Southern Command, the combatant command responsible for Latin America, he had testified before the Senate and had said, and this is back in, I think, 2014, around that time frame, and he had said back then that Russia's presence in Latin America has superseded what the Soviet Union had during its heyday in the 1980s in the region. And we all remember that the Soviets were very active in Central America. And even before that, in the 1960s, it led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a very dark moment in U.S. Foreign policy. But to begin this, let me give a little bit of my perspective on what's happening in Ukraine, because I think everything in today's global environment is in some way or another, we have connections and there's synergies, and particularly when we talk about transregional networks. So I want to talk a little bit about the assessment of what Vladimir Putin's calculations were into invading Ukraine. So I think it was clear that for about 2 months, maybe more, of the military buildup that Russia did on the borders of Ukraine, there was a constant conversation of whether he's going to invade, if he's going to invade, how is he going to invade, where is he going to invade. And I think in that conversation, Vladimir Putin was making a very precise calculation as to what the reaction and response would be, first from NATO, then from the European Union, and more importantly from the United States, to calculate what actions he will take. And I think the first calculation that Vladimir Putin made was that there would be no military response. I think it was very clear with the statements by Germany and Italy, and I think even after the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan, it almost seemed like the United States probably would not do anything, because even if it did, it may not look as pretty. But so the first calculation, I think that there's not going to be a military response, so the military risk of taking military action inside Ukraine was considerably low for Vladimir Putin. But Vladimir Putin knew that there would be a response. He knew that they would not just go quietly. There would be a response, particularly if he did the type of invasion that he did at the end of February, which was a very conventional bombardment, and where he has other tools in his toolbox in terms of hybrid war. And that response, and I think this is what Vladimir Putin knew, would come through economic pressure. And that was no surprise. I think sanctions, de-swifting, and all the economic measures that have been taken up to date, both by the United States and the European Union and the international community, are things that Vladimir Putin knew and has prepared for a very long time. Let us go back to 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. This is when sanctions were first getting imposed at a high level against Russia for that annexation by the then government of President Barack Obama. So I actually was in Bolivia, Santa Cruz, Bolivia, in 2014. This is in June of 2014, a few months after Russia annexed Crimea. And the United Nations had a conference in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. It's called the G77. I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. And in fact, it was the 50th anniversary of the G77. And the then president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, gave an invitation to Russia to join this conference of the G77 in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. Russia is not a member of the G77, as we know. And one of the things that Russia inserted into the final declaration of the G77, and I'm going to read this, it's point 131 of the final declaration. This is back in June of 2014, for those that want to reference. But this is point 131. This is what Russia put into the final declaration. And I'm quoting, "We," meaning the group of 77, "affirm the need to reform the international financial architecture so that we have a financial monetary system that reflects the reality of the 21st century." Now, the individual that advised Russia to put this type of language inside the G77's declaration was the former economic integration advisor to Vladimir Putin up until 2019, Mr. Sergei Glaziev. And so for those that aren't unfamiliar with Mr. Sergei Glaziev, he has a very infamous record inside Russia for being one of the most anti-US figures in the Russian hierarchy. In fact, he wrote a book in 1999 called Genocide, Russia and the New World Order. And he constantly was advising Vladimir Putin pretty much throughout his entire mandate, up until about 2019 when he got dismissed, about exactly how to use economic warfare against the United States. So this is a quote from Sergei Glaziev, not at the G77 conference in Bolivia, but in another interview that he gave in the same year in 2014. And the quote by Mr. Glaziev is, "The entire crisis in Ukraine," and he's referring to Crimea at the time, this is 2014, "the entire crisis in Ukraine was provoked by American institutions with their European partners. They financed neo-Nazis." So those were the words of Sergei Glaziev in 2014, but those are the words of Vladimir Putin today. In fact, if you watch or listen or read to Vladimir Putin's remarks prior to the invasion of Ukraine, it's almost like he took things verbatim from Sergei Glaziev's books and writings in previous times. So my point to all this is to say that I believe Vladimir Putin welcomed the sanctions. He wanted the sanctions because he wanted the opportunity to be able to victimize himself, to be able to attack the international financial system. And the best way to do that, the best way to go after the international financial system, is to build an anti-dollar alliance. And this is something that they have, this is why they were at the G77 2014. This is what the diplomatic push is happening here in Latin America, and not just in Latin America, but I think in Africa and Middle East and South Asia and other, what they call the global South-South. And I think this is at the heart of what Vladimir Putin's calculations and intentions and ambitions are with his invasion of Ukraine. It's very possible that the conflict, the physical conflict inside Ukraine, ends in a stalemate, maybe in some sense of a civil war where the East and the West are kind of divided into almost two countries. But if that happens, and I'm sure many will look at that as a victory by Ukraine or as a defeat to Vladimir Putin, but if that happens, and on the flip side, they're able to convince more countries to get away from the US dollar as their main foreign reserve, that's a victory for Vladimir Putin. My point to say that we have to go beyond just the physical dimension of warfare and look at other dimensions to understand the complexity and the entirety of this conflict that's happening in Ukraine. One of the main tools that Russia, along with Iran, along with North Korea, along with Cuba and Venezuela and China, have developed as a sort of vaccine, if you will, against sanctions is disinformation. And this is where a lot of what we're seeing here in Latin America, the disinformation has gone through the roof. It's been high for a long time with the pandemic and everything, but it's gone through the roof after the invasion of Ukraine. And the number one message that's in the disinformation networks of Russia in Latin America, whether it's in Spanish or Portuguese, is a message, a narrative that's saying that sanctions are a crime against humanity. That sanctions are what they call, this is a term that they're inserting into the United Nations, quote, unilateral coercive measures by the United States or the Europeans. And in that, they say, look, listen, the United States and the Europeans, they use the SWIFT system or the international financial system as a weapon of warfare, not as a weapon of commerce. China, Russia, these other nations, we use it just to do business. That is the principal message that they're bringing here into Latin America. And here's a data point that I think is telling this, that at some level, this is actually having an effect. In December 2021, just a month before the end of the year of last year, Russia's electronic transfer payment system, which is the SPFS, is their version of the SWIFT, had only 38 international participants in 9 countries. Since the invasion of Ukraine, that has skyrocketed to more than 400 participants in 20 countries. They are selling this new international financial system, and that's the Russian one. China has CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, which is also being proposed. And their economic blackmail for this is food insecurity. You know, here in Colombia, for instance, 50 kilograms of wheat would cost about $20 on an average day inside the local markets. Today, it's close to $65. It's skyrocketed the price of wheat. The price of fertilizer has gone up quite a bit. Countries like Brazil, depend on fertilizer for 23% of its imports from Russia. Russia and Ukraine combined account for more than 30% of the total exports globally of wheat, and Russia alone is the largest exporter of fertilizer in the world. And this is, I think, how they're going to be able to engage in this economic warfare, because in some sense, as I mentioned before, it's a form of economic blackmail against these more indebted and weaker economic countries to say, listen, if you want to feed your people and you want fertilizer or wheat from Russia, then you're going to have to get off the international financial system. You're going to have to get off the dollar. And there's countries in Latin America that are going to aid them. I'll mention some specifically, and I'll go into detail on one or two. El Salvador and the cryptocurrency phrase, the attempts, I should say, by President Nayib Bukele to turn his country into a sort of Bitcoin paradise is in many ways in aiding and abetting this move away from the dollar. El Salvador is a dollarized country. Without mentioning Venezuela and Nicaragua, the obvious ones are Cuba, Argentina, which is one of the most indebted countries in Latin America that has a current negotiation with the IMF because of its high levels of foreign debt, is currently talking with Russia about using non-dollar denominated trade. And even Brazil, who has a president that's an ally to the United States and is very friendly with conservative networks, President Jair Bolsonaro, someone that I have looked as a prominent partner in the region, has also, with his back up against the wall, as I mentioned, 23% of his imports in fertilizer come from Russia, and in a sense is getting played by Vladimir Putin. The recent trip that some of you might have seen in the news of President Bolsonaro's trip to Russia, ill-timed, but is actually a move that Vladimir Putin actually played on by Jair Bolsonaro, because the Brazilian government asked for that trip last year. I believe it was in October of last year. And then the Russia would say, wait, hold on. And then after they invade Ukraine, they say, well, now's a good time. Why don't you come on over? For a negotiation that the Brazilians need. They cannot have a deal. They cannot have a non-deal with Russia on fertilizer. So my point to all that is to say that Russia is playing hardball, both diplomatically, disinformation, and in many other ways that aren't conventional warfare, but it's using the Ukraine crisis. I don't even say using. I think its purpose behind the Ukraine war is to basically shift the attention of many countries in the global south away from the US dollar and the international financial system that it upholds. If this is about international order, you're not going to change international order without changing the international financial and monetary system. So with that, let me go into a little bit of the context here in Colombia and in neighboring Venezuela. So, going back to what I said at the beginning, what they talked about with, Russian military assets here to Venezuela and Cuba. So I have been here now in Colombia for quite a while, going on almost 2 months. I've been in and out, but I was here last year as well. And in fact, I traveled to the border of Venezuela and Colombia, different points along the border. And I'll mention one of them. This is actually presented in a video on the center's YouTube page, Secure Free Society, if you want to check it out. The video is called Border Wars Arauca. And Arauca is both a department in a city on the border with Venezuela. And it's probably the most dangerous border in the Western Hemisphere. As bad as our southern border is, the Colombia-Venezuela border, and specifically Arauca, is about as bad as borders can get. Starting with a humanitarian issue because of the mass migration from Venezuela. Remember, 6 million Venezuelans have left that country since 2014. That turned to an illicit crisis of all kinds of narcotics moving to and through the border. That's now gone into a straight armed conflict among irregular actors, meaning narco-terrorist groups of many stripes are now fighting along the border, skyrocketing the casualty rates and pretty much creating a war zone along this border. So I traveled to Arauca last September, and as you can see in the video, the number one takeaway from my trip to Arauca wasn't the fighting among the FARC and the ELN narco-terrorists. It wasn't even the Maduro regime's military provocations along the border. It was the Russian military and espionage equipment that was actually complicating the conditions along the border and spying both on the Colombian military and also using disinformation to create false narratives. Let me explain. So what Russia did is they provided 3 major critical technologies to the Maduro regime in Venezuela: drones, radars, and satellites. What that does combine, and I'll actually give an anecdote to make this point crystal clear. When I was on the border, I'm on the river. There's a river called Rio Arauca that separates the border in this part of Venezuela and Colombia. And when I was along the river, I had my cell phone. And for those that know Colombia, Venezuela, there's a difference in the time zone of about half an hour. And at some points along the river, my phone would change its time. It would change its local time from half an hour, which means that I have gone away from the Colombian telecommunications signal to getting absorbed by the Venezuelan telecommunications signal. When that happened and we ran the diagnostics on my phone, we found out that that was being controlled by Russian satellites, the GLONASS system, the GPS system of Russia. So what that meant was Russia's signals and radio frequency and spectrum was powerful enough along the border that it crosses into Colombia. You don't have to go into Venezuelan territory to be affected by that. Now, if you combine the satellite system with the mobile radar, specifically the P-18 mobile radars, which are very high-end, it's basically the same radar system that the Russians have used both in Crimea, Syria, Libya, Nagorno-Karabakh, and other border conflicts. It allows them to get eyes, it allows them to get ears across the border. And what allows them to get eyes are the Orlan 10 reconnaissance drones. When you combine those three technologies, you have essentially the capability to go beyond the border and have a complete intelligence collection and assessments of what your adversary or counterpart are doing on the other side. The Colombians have repeatedly complained about this because I'm talking about my cell phone here, and this is, my civilian cell phone. Military encrypted communications of the Colombians has been intercepted repeatedly by the Russians. So in that, let me just say that this kind of espionage, so what is this being used for? And I think it's principally used to understand the Colombian maneuver so that they can have a very precise disinformation campaign. And one of the things that disinformation campaign is focused on is that painting Venezuela as a narco state. I'm sorry, one of those focus of that disinformation is to paint Colombia as a narco state and Venezuela as a fighter against narcotics. Now, that's very ironic for many of us who know that Venezuela is one of the principal transit countries of cocaine and other narcotics, and that the Maduro regime itself, high-ranking figures within the Maduro regime, have open indictments inside various courts in the United States for being involved in massive amounts of narcotic shipments. But nonetheless, as disinformation tends to do, it flips reality and turns lies into truth, or at least the perception of truth, and then tries to confuse the scenarios. So what Russia did in the case of this Arauca conflict, remember, there's all this fighting among different types of narco-terrorist groups, some aligned with the Maduro regime, some against the Maduro regime. But what the Russians decided to do was they decided to hold repeated press conferences where the foreign ministry of Russia has said, the solution to this border conflict among Colombia and Venezuela, and we're very concerned about this, is to put Nicolas Maduro and President Ivan Duque at the table together and to negotiate a settlement along the border. Now, what does that do? Had President Duque had fallen for that trap, what would that have done? It creates a false moral equivalency between a democratically elected leader, which is President Ivan Duque of Colombia, and a dictator, someone that was never elected, a usurper that actually has stolen his country's democracy and has now imposed complete authoritarianism. My point to all that to say that Russia has now engaged in a robust espionage, spying, and disinformation campaign that is unprecedented in Latin America. They've invested tremendously into their state-owned and controlled media networks, going from 5 million followers to RT and Espanol back in 2018 to more than 20 million today. They capitalized on the pandemic to do that. And they're using all kinds of digital manipulation techniques to drive disinformation, to sow social instability and create more chaos. One final point, because I'm here in Colombia, just this past Sunday, so this is very recent, very fresh, Colombian media had reported some investigation that were done by both Colombian intelligence, including with counterparts in the United States, about Russian meddling in the internal affairs here in Colombia. What does this mean? Last year, there was major national protests here in Colombia. Very brutal, violent protests that had legitimate origins, but that spiraled completely out of control to the point that they were burning police stations and just violating and vandalizing the entire multiple cities inside the country. And what this investigation that was just revealed on Sunday found out was that there were Russian financiers behind some of that violence, vandalism, and agitation. So these are things that are complete. In the world, Colombia has an election this year in May, a very important presidential election with two polar opposite candidates, one that's more pro-US, market friendly, and the other is a socialist aligned with Maduro and the rest of the socialist communist networks in Latin America. I'm referring to Senator Gustavo Petro. And so this is a high stakes election. And as we tend to find in other parts of the world, Russia's messing with the internal situation as this development rolls about.
Thank you, Joseph. This has been a very important update, and it's information that is necessary for us at the Institute to really know. I'm pleased that Saul and Herman are on this call, as they spend most of their time focused on this region, on the Spanish-speaking countries as well. So thank you for that.